We're continuing on this morning in our series in Luke's Gospel, and hopefully you can remember that the title of this series is Jesus, the Master Storyteller. It may well be that some of you over the course of this lockdown have been getting really into stories. Maybe some of you have Netflix and you've been binge watching a particular series and you've been getting really into the story. Maybe some of you have got a series of novels on your shelf and you've been meaning to get to them for years, but you haven't managed that, and you've decided now is the time to try and get through those stories. We human beings, we love stories, don't we? But I'm sure that if you have been getting into different stories over the last few weeks, you'll be well aware that different stories are different. Some stories are really predictable. Right from the very start, you know exactly where they're going and you know exactly how they're going to end. Other stories, I would say perhaps better stories, have twists and turns and they take you by surprise. In fact, just this last week, I finished a story that I've been reading for quite a long time, and the end of that story, it was like a punch in the gut. The last sentence of the story I've been thinking about for days since. The best stories can take you by surprise. Well, Jesus is the master storyteller, and over the course of this series, we're looking at some of the stories that he told. They are incredibly short, they are very, very simple, and yet there's nothing predictable about these stories. In fact, very much the opposite. Often these stories are like a punch to the stomach. And this morning, the story that we're looking at is no exception. It is jam-packed full with surprise. And to help us understand the surprise of this story, what we want to do this morning is to go back in time. We want to pretend that we don't live in the year 2020, we live in the 1st century. We want to pretend that we're sitting there, we're listening to Jesus telling this story. It's the very first time that he's told it. And there we are, we're sitting on the edge of our seats, we're following the twists and the turns, and we're being taken by surprise. Now, this story we're looking at this morning, it's all about opposites. We have two different men, we have two different prayers, and we have two different results. And we want to see these differences together this morning. So first of all, we want to see two men. Now Jesus begins this story in verse 10 by telling us two men went to the temple to pray. One man is a Pharisee, the other is a tax collector. And you see, this is why it's really, really important that we get into our time machines and we imagine that we're listening to Jesus. You see, for us living today, Pharisee is almost like a bad word. The Pharisees are like the pantomime villains. You see them coming on the stage and you get ready to boo and you get ready to hiss because these are the bad guys. But they weren't. The very, very first people to hear this story, they would have had a very different reaction. You see, to them, the Pharisees were heroes. The Pharisees made it their mission to take a stand against the evils of society. The Pharisees made enormous sacrifices. The Pharisees devoted themselves to studying God's Word. In fact, I've heard it said that the Pharisees would have memorized the entire Old Testament. These were the good guys. And so whenever Jesus says that one of the Pharisees went to the temple to pray, nobody is even remotely surprised. Of course, the Pharisee is doing that. The reaction would have been very different when Jesus said who the second man was. He was a tax collector. And I wonder, at this point, was there a gasp in the crowd? Did he really say a tax collector? Jesus might as well have said that two animals took off and flew into the sky. One animal was a bird, the other was a pig. Because if a tax collector is going to the temple to pray, well then, a pig might as well fly. Tax collectors didn't do this. You see, tax collectors in those days were the scum of the earth. And in case you think that I'm being unfair to tax collectors, I want to give you a couple of reasons why I say that. The first reason is that the tax collectors worked for the Romans. Now, the Roman army had marched into Israel. They had slaughtered thousands and thousands of Jews. They had even gone into the temple. They had gone into the Holy of Holies, and they had desecrated it. So you try and imagine if you're a Jew and you're living in Israel and you look around the holy streets of Jerusalem, and what do you see? You see savage, filthy Gentile soldiers. And then imagine, on top of this outrage, you have to actually pay the salaries of these men. You pay taxes so you can have the privilege of having these Gentile soldiers occupy your land. The tax collectors were paying the salaries of these soldiers. The closest equivalent I can think of would be the collaborators in France in World War II. And there were men and women, and they were perfectly happy to cooperate with the Nazis, because if they cooperated, they got better rations, they got better supplies, they got special treatment, and they were absolutely despised for how they helped the enemy. Well, the tax collectors were just like that. A tax collector was a traitor. That's the first reason why the tax collectors were the scum of the earth. They worked with the Romans. But there's a second reason. You see, these tax collectors were fabulously wealthy. Don't think of someone who works for revenue. Think of a mobster. Think of a member of the mafia. See, these men, they would pay a certain sum to the Romans. And after they had paid that sum, they then had the right to collect the tax money and to keep the tax money for themselves. And these men, they had a huge amount of scope to basically invent whatever taxes they wanted. They could tax you for the crops you grew. They could tax you for the house you lived in. They could tax you for the food you bought at the market. They could tax you for travelling along certain roads. They could tax you for using certain bridges. And this allowed these men to become fabulously wealthy, all at the expense of their fellow countrymen. The Romans, they were shedding Jewish blood at the point of the sword. But the tax collectors, they weren't any better, because they were bleeding the people dry. The tax collectors were the scum of the earth. If Jesus was telling this story in the year 2020, I wonder what he might say. A minister and a drug dealer went to the church to pray. A bishop and a pimp went to the church to pray. In the space of just one verse, Jesus has got us on the edge of our seats. So that's the first difference we see. 2 men. Second thing we see, 2 prayers. Right, let's begin with the Pharisees' prayer. It starts really well, doesn't it? God, I thank you. But then very, very quickly it goes downhill. God, I thank you that I am not like other men, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. And you can imagine the swagger as this man walks into the temple. You can imagine that put on, insincere look of piety on his face. You can imagine him looking around the temple, looking for the most prominent spot where he knows he's going to be seen. And you can imagine him walking to that spot. You can imagine him puffing out his chest. He's desperate to be seen. One writer put it this way. He says, he came strutting into God's house, reeking with self-complacency. I don't know if maybe you are familiar with the concept of a humble brag. Something that you see quite often on social media. Basically, the idea is somebody will write something that in theory is humble, but in practice it's boastful. So for example, a celebrity might say, just can't believe that I have been given the greatest Hero of the Year award. I really don't deserve this. There's other people far more deserving than I am. Of course, that celebrity would say that they're expressing humility, but we know exactly what they're doing. They're drawing attention to the fact that they've been given this award. And in one sense, that is a bit like what the Pharisee's doing. It's a humble brag. In theory, he is thanking God. In theory, he is giving God all of the credit. But in practice, he's bigging himself up. It is an unbelievably self-centered prayer. I am not like other men. I fast twice a week. I give a tenth of what I get. I mean, to be perfectly honest, it's not actually a prayer at all, is it? Yes, he begins with God, but that's just like the formality. He has to get that out of the way before he can keep on going, because after he starts the prayer, he never mentions God again. In fact, the language that Luke uses here is very, very interesting. Notice it says the Pharisee stood up and prayed about himself. But as you can see from your footnotes, if you have the Bible in your hand there, you could also translate that as the Pharisee began to pray to himself. It's not a prayer at all. It's a farce. We should be outraged by what this Pharisee is doing. But we do want to be careful. We want to make sure that we are outraged by the right thing here. There's no indication that the Pharisee is lying. He's not like a robber. He's not like a traitor or a crook like this tax collector. In fact, there's a great deal to commend the Pharisee for. He fasts twice a week, even though the requirement was only to fast once a year. He gives a tenth of everything he gets, even though the requirement was only to give a tenth of certain things. If this man was about today, we would think he's great. He would be at every single church service. He'd be at every single prayer time, every single outreach event. He'd be there early to put out the chairs. He'd be there late to clean the toilets. This is the sort of man, and if you were to give him a birthday present, he would ask you for a receipt. Not so he can go and return the present, but so he can work out the value, so he can take 10% and put it into the collection. He is an incredibly diligent man, and there's nothing wrong with being diligent. But the problem is, the way this man views God is incredibly insulting. This man thinks that God is a bank manager. He thinks that if he can just make enough deposits, then he's going to be in credit. But that is not the way it works. God doesn't want us to deposit our good works in the bank of heaven. And anybody who says that that's what God is looking for is insulting God. God deserves far, far more than being treated as a bank manager. God deserves for us to love him with all of our heart and all of our soul. He deserves for us to love him more than we love ourselves. And I don't know about you, but I don't love my bank manager like that. This Pharisee, he's congratulating himself for all of these sins that he avoids. But the fact of the matter is, he is committing by far the worst sin of all. This man has no idea of just how lost he is. This man thinks that he has walked far enough along the road of salvation. He has no idea he's not even on the right road to begin with. This isn't how God works. You cannot twist God's arm. You cannot earn your way into God's favour. This man has got it tragically wrong. Now that's the first prayer. The tax collector's prayer, on the other hand, it couldn't be more different. The Pharisee puffs out his chest. The tax collector beats his chest. The Pharisee looks down on all these other people. The tax collector looks down to the ground. And notice what the tax collector doesn't say in his prayer. He doesn't say, I thank you, God, that I am not as bad as other tax collectors. No. All he says is, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. In fact, in the original Greek, what he says is, God, have mercy on me, the sinner. He is so broken and he is so ashamed by his sin that as far as he's concerned, he might as well be the only sinner in the entire world. Have mercy on me, the sinner. And his prayer, it's very short, isn't it? It must be just about the simplest prayer in the entire history of the world. In fact, it's almost like an SOS call in the middle of the ocean, isn't it? God, have mercy on me. It's all he asks for. One writer says, he asked for God's mercy because mercy was the only thing he dared ask for. It's a very different prayer from the Pharisee, isn't it? So we've seen two men, two prayers. Thirdly, we see two results. We should be shocked by this story. One of these men is a minister. He's a man of God. He preaches sermons. He leads Bible studies. The other man is a mobster, sort of man who buys flash cars because he's taken all of your hard-earned cash. And yet Jesus tells us in verse 14, it is the gangster rather than the minister who goes home justified. Now, that word justified is very important. I think Mark spoke about it last week in the children's address. Justified, what that means is God pardons this man's sins and he accepts him as righteous in his sight. The tax collector is justified. But how can this be the case? How can he be justified and the Pharisee not? Well, the first thing we need to understand is it's not as if God has some sort of vendetta against Pharisees. Either of these two men could have gone home justified. In fact, both of these men came to exactly the right place to be justified. They were in the temple, and the temple was the place where animals were sacrificed. Of course, animals don't actually do a single thing to take away sin, but what animals did do is they pointed forward to the one who would. The animals got people ready for the true sacrifice, the final sacrifice, the sacrifice of Jesus Christ himself as he went to the cross. And anybody could go to the temple and they could throw themselves on the mercy of this Messiah. That's what the temple was for. So both of these men came to the right place. The problem is the Pharisee got things disastrously wrong. The Pharisee, he's a bit like a man who has a serious illness. He's been experiencing different symptoms for a number of weeks, and so he goes to the doctor. But when he gets there, he doesn't tell the doctor about any of his symptoms. He spends half of his time telling the doctor how fit he is, how many marathons he runs, and then he spends the rest of his time talking about the other people in the waiting room, and how sick they look, and how they must be in a really bad way. It's a farce, and it's a tragedy. The cure is there to be had, but he won't accept that he needs it. And that's exactly what the Pharisee is doing. The tax collector, on the other hand, he knows how sick he is. And so the tax collector pleads for the cure. He flings himself upon the mercy of God. He trusts in the Messiah. He trusts that someone is coming who is going to die in his place. He trusts that there is a way for even him to have his sins dealt with. And so the tax collector goes home justified. Now, I do think it's important to realise at this point, these two men probably would have felt very different as they went home. I am sure the Pharisee felt every bit as smug and every bit as confident as he did when he came in. And I'm sure the tax collector was every bit as aware of the gravity of his sin. If the question was, which man feels most justified, the answer would probably be the Pharisee. But that's not the question. The question is, which man is actually justified? And it's the man that nobody expects. This passage warns us, doesn't it? You know, as I've been reflecting on this passage over the last week, the thought has occurred to me that possibly one of the most dangerous things it is possible for a person to do is to watch the news. See, whenever you watch the news, you hear about all sorts of horrible things that all sorts of horrible people do. You hear about violence, you hear about lies and bribery and crime, and it's very, very easy for us to pat ourselves on the back. It's very easy for us to say, well, at least I'm not like that. And all the while, we can be committing the most serious sin of all. We can be living as if we don't need God. We can be paying God lip service, just like the Pharisee did, and we don't see it because we're so focused on the sins of other people. And one of the dangers of looking down on others is that we never see the guilt within our own hearts. And Jesus has given us this parable to warn us. Notice verse 9. Jesus tells us who this parable is for. It is for those who are confident of their own righteousness and look down on everyone else. I wonder, is this parable a wake-up call for some of you? Is this story telling you something that you desperately need to hear? What really matters isn't how much good you've done. It isn't how much better you are than other people. It isn't how many services you watch on YouTube. It isn't how much money you give to charity. It isn't how many prayers you say in a day. The one and only thing that determines if you are justified or not justified is whether you have brought your sin to Jesus Christ. Have you done that? Have you flinged yourself upon Christ's mercy? Maybe this morning you have done that. You have flung yourself upon Christ's mercy. You are flinging yourself upon Christ's mercy every single day. You're pleading with him to pardon your sins. You're pleading with him to make you righteous in God's sight. Well, what I want you to know this morning is what really matters isn't how you feel. What really matters is what Jesus Christ says. Those feelings of guilt, they don't determine whether you're justified or not any more than they did for the tax collector. It is the facts that matter. And the fact is, Jesus Christ has died. He has dealt with the sins of all of his people. People like this tax collector, people like you and like me. And so one of the lessons of this parable is that you need to look beyond your feelings and you need to look to the facts. Facts like these. Titus chapter 3 verse 5. He saved us not because of the righteous things we had done, but because of his mercy. Psalm 103 verse 12. As far as the east is distant from the west, so far has he removed our transgression from us. Those are the facts for you. If your prayer is the same as that of the tax collector, God, have mercy on me, a sinner.